more reckless gamble, the invasion of the Soviet Union. The first crack in the machine would lead to its ultimate fracture. After failing to break Britain, Hitler's gaze turned eastward. Impatient and convinced that his destiny lay in the vast plains of the Soviet Union, he made the most fateful decision of the war. On June 22, 1941, he unleashed Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. This was not merely another military campaign. It was the ultimate gamble, an operation of unprecedented scale and ambition, involving over 3 million German soldiers, thousands of tanks, and thousands of aircraft. It was the largest and most powerful invasion force ever assembled in human history. Hitler was betting everything on one final decisive blow that he believed would win him the war and secure his 1,000-year Reich. For Hitler, the invasion was the culmination of his life's work. The war against the Soviet Union was not just a strategic necessity in his mind, it was an ideological crusade. He saw it as an inevitable clash between Nazism and Jewish Bolshevism, a racial war for Lebensraum, or living space, for the German people. He believed the Soviet state was a rotten structure, led by an inferior Slavic race and a Jewish elite, that would collapse at the first kick. He told his generals to expect a swift victory, predicting the entire campaign would be over in a matter of months, long before the onset of the harsh Russian winter. This was to be blitzkrieg on a continental scale. The attack achieved complete tactical surprise. Stalin, despite numerous warnings from his own intelligence and from the West, had refused to believe that Hitler would betray their non-aggression pact. In the opening hours and days of the invasion, the Luftwaffe decimated the Soviet Air Force on the ground. German panzer divisions sliced through the unprepared Soviet front lines, executing massive encirclements that trapped and destroyed entire armies. The initial advance was staggering. The German war machine seemed to have regained its unstoppable momentum, pushing hundreds of miles into Soviet territory, capturing key cities, and taking millions of prisoners. The map of Europe was once again being redrawn at a terrifying speed. At first, it appeared that Hitler's audacious gamble would pay off. The German army advanced relentlessly across Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states. The sheer scale of the initial victories was breathtaking, seemingly confirming Hitler's belief in the weakness of the Soviet regime and the superiority of his own war machine. The world watched in horror as the Wehrmacht drove deeper and deeper into the heart of Russia, with Moscow itself appearing to be within its grasp. But the very scale of this success was deceptive. The vastness of the territory being conquered was planting the seeds of a logistical nightmare, and the brutality of the invasion was forging a resistance of a kind the Germans had never before encountered. The war on the Eastern Front was fundamentally different from the campaigns in the West. This was not a traditional war of conquest between nations. It was envisioned by the Nazi regime as a Vernichtungskrieg, a war of annihilation. The ideological underpinnings of Nazism, with their toxic blend of racial supremacy and anti-communism, stripped away all conventional restraints of warfare. Hitler's directives explicitly called for a war of unprecedented brutality. Soviet political commissars were to be shot on sight. The civilian population was to be treated with utter ruthlessness. This was not just about defeating an army. It was about eradicating an entire political system and subjugating a population deemed racially inferior. This ideological framework transformed the battlefield into a landscape of unimaginable horror. As the German army advanced, it was followed by special SS units, known as Einsatzgruppen. Their mission was not military, it was mass murder. They moved from town to town, rounding up Jews, communists, intellectuals, and other perceived enemies of the Reich, and executing them in mass shootings. These actions were the beginning of the Holocaust on an industrial scale. The war in the East provided the cover and the radicalizing environment for the Nazi regime to begin implementing its final solution. The violence was not a byproduct of the war, it was a central objective of it. For the common German soldier, this ideological poison seeped into every aspect of the campaign. Years of propaganda had dehumanized the enemy, portraying the Soviet people as subhuman Untermenschen. This indoctrination made it easier for ordinary men to participate in or stand by and witness atrocities that would have been unthinkable in another context. The war became a brutalizing experience that eroded the moral compass of an entire army. The line between soldier and executioner blurred, and the war machine became an instrument not only of military conquest, but of systematic, ideologically driven extermination. This removed any possibility of winning the hearts and minds of the occupied population. The Soviet response was equally fierce. Faced with a war for their very survival, the Soviet people and state mobilized with a ferocity born of desperation. Stalin, using the language of Russian nationalism rather than communist ideology, called for a great patriotic war. He sanctioned a scorched earth policy, ordering that anything of value that could not be evacuated, factories, crops, infrastructure, be destroyed to deny it to the invaders. Partisan units were formed to operate behind German lines, attacking supply columns, sabotaging railways, and terrorizing German soldiers. The German war machine found itself fighting not just the Red Army, but an entire population that had been turned into a hostile and unforgiving enemy. Throughout the summer and autumn of 1941, the German war machine continued its seemingly unstoppable advance. Army Group North pushed toward Leningrad, placing the city under a brutal siege that would last for 900 days. Army Group South swept through Ukraine, capturing Kiev in a massive encirclement that netted over 600,000 prisoners, one of the largest such victories in military history. Army Group Center drove relentlessly toward the ultimate prize, Moscow. By October, German forward units were so close to the Soviet capital that some soldiers claimed they could see the spires of the Kremlin through their binoculars. Victory seemed imminent. The illusion was nearly complete. Nazi propaganda, both at home and abroad, trumpeted these successes as proof that the war was already won. Newsreels showed endless columns of Soviet prisoners and vast collections of captured equipment. Hitler confidently announced to the German people that the enemy had been broken and would never rise again. He began making grandiose plans for the colonization of the East, for the construction of great German cities, and for the exploitation of its vast resources. He was so certain of victory that the production of winter clothing and equipment for the troops was given low priority. The war machine, he believed, had done its job. The rest was merely a mopping-up operation. But the victories, as enormous as they were hollow. The German army was winning battles, but losing the war. Each mile they advanced stretched their supply lines further, making it increasingly difficult to get fuel, ammunition, and food to the front. The primitive Russian road network turned to a sea of mud in the autumn rains, bogging down tanks and trucks. The sheer size of the country was swallowing the German army whole. They had conquered vast territories, but they lacked the manpower to control them effectively, leaving their long flanks and rear areas vulnerable to the growing partisan threat. The war machine was bleeding strength with every victory. Furthermore, the Red Army, despite catastrophic losses, was not breaking. Unlike France, the Soviet Union had immense strategic depth. It could trade space for time. As the Germans advanced, the Soviets were evacuating key factories eastward beyond the Ural Mountains, where they could continue to produce tanks, aircraft, and guns safe from the German advance. And for every soldier the Red Army lost, it seemed to find two more. Drawing on the vast population reserves of its huge territory, the German generals at the front began to feel a sense of unease. They were destroying army after army, yet new ones kept appearing. The war machine was punching at a sponge. In late 1941, the German offensive against Moscow, codenamed Operation Typhoon, ran into its most formidable opponent, the Russian winter. The autumn mud that had bogged down the advance froze solid, and the temperature began to plummet. It was one of the coldest winters in decades, with temperatures dropping to -40 degrees Celsius and below. The German war machine, designed for a swift summer campaign, ground to a halt. The soldiers were utterly unprepared. They lacked adequate winter clothing, greatcoats, felt-lined boots, and gloves. Frostbite became as great an enemy as the Red Army, incapacitating tens of thousands of troops. The cold was a relentless, invisible enemy that attacked every man and every machine. The technology of the Blitzkrieg failed. German tank engines wouldn't start. Lubricants froze solid. rifles and machine guns jammed. The finely tuned war machine, so effective in the temperate climate of Western Europe, was breaking down in the brutal conditions of the East. The Luftwaffe was often grounded by the weather, unable to provide air support. Supply lines, already stretched to the breaking point, collapsed almost entirely as railways froze and the few passable roads became blocked with snow and ice. The once mighty panzers were reduced to frozen steel coffins, stranded in the vast white wasteland. The advance on Moscow was over. It was at this moment of maximum German weakness that the Red Army struck back. On December 5, 1941, the Soviets launched a massive counter-offensive in front of Moscow. Using fresh divisions transferred from Siberia, troops who were well-equipped and trained for winter warfare, they slammed into the exhausted and frozen German lines. The shock was immense. For the first time in the campaign, the German army was not attacking. It was reeling backward, forced into a desperate retreat. The myth of Wehrmacht invincibility, already cracked in the Battle of Britain, was now shattered in the snows before Moscow. The Blitzkrieg was dead. Hitler, panicking at the prospect of a Napoleonic-style collapse, refused to authorize a strategic withdrawal to a more defensible line. Instead, he issued a fanatical stand-fast order, demanding that his soldiers hold their ground at all costs. While this order may have prevented a complete rout, it came at a terrible price. German units were forced to dig in where they stood, suffering horrendous casualties from the cold and the relentless Soviet attacks. The German army survived the winter, but it was a shadow of its former self. It had suffered its first major land defeat of the war, and the Eastern Front had devolved into the very thing Hitler had sought to avoid, a long, grinding war of attrition. The failure to capture Moscow and the brutal experience of the first winter marked a fundamental shift in the nature of the war in the East. The conflict had lost all semblance of a conventional military campaign and had devolved into a war without limits, a primal struggle of endurance and annihilation. The front lines would now stretch for over 1,000 miles, a bloody scar across the face of Europe where millions of men would fight and die in some of the most savage battles in human history. The Eastern Front became a colossal meat grinder, consuming men and material at a rate that dwarfed all other theaters of the war combined. It was here that the German war machine would ultimately bleed to death. The ideological fanaticism that had launched the invasion now intensified in the face of stalemate and defeat. With the dream of a quick victory gone, the war's genocidal aspects became even more pronounced. The Holocaust accelerated. In January 1942, at the Wannsee Conference, Nazi officials formalized the plans for the final solution, coordinating a statewide bureaucracy to carry out the systematic extermination of Europe's Jews in death camps like Auschwitz. The war against the partisans intensified, with the German army engaging in brutal reprisal actions against civilians. The war machine was now inextricably linked with the machinery of mass murder. Every battle, every advance, every retreat was part of a larger, darker project. For Germany, the Eastern Front became an insatiable maw that devoured its resources. The need to supply and reinforce the armies in the East placed an immense strain on the German economy. Fuel, steel, and most importantly manpower were poured into the conflict in ever-increasing quantities. The losses were staggering. The elite, highly trained soldiers who had conquered France were replaced by younger, less experienced conscripts. The quality of German equipment began to decline as factories were forced to prioritize quantity over quality to keep up with the Red Army's massive production. The war machine was being worn down, its sharp edges blunted by the sheer scale and brutality of the fight. The Eastern gamble had failed. Hitler had not only failed to knock the Soviet Union out of the war, he had created a two-front war on a scale he could not win. While his armies were bleeding in the snows of Russia, Britain remained defiant, and across the Atlantic, another industrial giant was beginning to stir. The decision to invade the Soviet Union was not just a military blunder, it was a strategic catastrophe that sealed the fate of the Third Reich. It had opened a door to a war of attrition against an enemy with superior manpower and resources, a war that Germany was destined to lose. The machine was now trapped in a struggle for its own survival. While the German war machine was bleeding in the vast, frozen expanses of the Soviet Union, a seismic event on the other side of the world would irrevocably alter the course of the war. On December 7, 1941, Imperial Japan, Germany's ally in the Tripartite Pact, launched a surprise attack on the United States naval base at Pearl Harbor. This act of aggression was intended to cripple the US Pacific Fleet and secure Japan's dominance in Southeast Asia. Instead, it awoke a nation that had, until that moment, been deeply reluctant to enter the global conflict. The attack on Pearl Harbor galvanized American public opinion overnight, ending the era of isolationism and thrusting the United States directly into World War II. Just 4 days later, in a decision driven by ideological solidarity rather than sound strategy, Adolf Hitler made one of his most catastrophic blunders. Honoring his alliance with Japan, he declared war on the United States. He viewed America as a decadent, racially mixed, and politically weak nation that would be incapable of fighting an effective war on 2 fronts. This was a profound and, honestly, fatal miscalculation. By formally declaring war, Hitler removed any remaining constraints on President Franklin D. Roosevelt and unified the American people behind a total war effort. He had voluntarily brought the world's greatest industrial power into the fight against him, a power that possessed the resources, manpower, and organizational genius to wage war on a truly global scale. Germany was now facing an alliance of enemies with almost unimaginable power. In the east, it was locked in a brutal war of attrition with the Soviet Union, a nation of immense size and demographic depth. In the west, it faced the British Empire, which, though battered, controlled a global network of resources and remained an unsinkable base of operations. And now joining them was the United States, the arsenal of democracy. The conflict was no longer a series of lightning campaigns that Germany could control and direct. It had transformed into a global war of endurance, a long, grinding struggle that would be decided not just by battlefield tactics but by factories, supply lines, and economic might. This new reality fundamentally changed the equation of the war. The German war machine, built for short, decisive victories, was now pitted against a coalition that it could not hope to outlast. The Allies, the Grand Alliance of Britain, the Soviet Union, and the United States, could coordinate their strategies across continents. They could open new fronts, pool their technological knowledge, and, most importantly, overwhelm Germany with a sheer weight of material. Hitler's gamble on a quick victory had failed, and in its place he had created a global conflict against a trio of giants. The tide of the war, though it had not yet visibly turned, had begun its slow, inexorable shift. The entry of the United States turned World War II into a contest of industrial might, and the Axis powers were hopelessly outmatched. American factories rapidly shifted from cars to tanks and planes, while shipyards churned out Liberty ships at record speed. The US outproduced Germany, Japan, and Italy combined, overwhelming the Axis with sheer numbers. The war became a battle of logistics and supply lines, where the Allies could absorb losses and replace them with ease. In the Atlantic, mass-produced escort ships and new technologies turned the tide against German U-boats, ensuring Allied supply lines to Britain. Strategic bombing campaigns intensified, targeting Germany's industrial heartland and forcing the Luftwaffe into a defensive war. The relentless Allied production and firepower steadily eroded Germany's ability to fight. The machine was now being attacked at its source. In North Africa, Rommel's early successes gave way to Allied dominance as American-made tanks and supplies tipped the balance. Rommel's supply lines were overstretched and harassed, while the Eastern Front drained Germany's resources. At El Alamein, Montgomery's reinforced British Eighth Army launched a crushing offensive, breaking Rommel's lines. The myth of German invincibility shattered as the Afrika Korps retreated. Operation Torch landed Allied forces in Morocco and Algeria, trapping Axis armies in a pincer. The Axis could no longer sustain the fight on multiple fronts. North Africa became a desperate struggle to delay inevitable defeat. The tide had not only turned, it was now a flood. As North Africa fell, the true turning point came at Stalingrad. Hitler's obsession with the city led to a brutal urban battle, grinding down the German Sixth Army. Soviet forces encircled and trapped over 250,000 Germans, sealing their fate. Hitler refused retreat, promising impossible airlifts. The army starved and froze. In February 1943, the remnants surrendered, an unprecedented disaster for Germany. The myth of the unstoppable German army was shattered. From Stalingrad onward, the German war machine was forced onto the defensive.